everybody and welcome back to my channel. I am Sam and today I would like to share with you 5 tips I wish I knew when I started knitting. These 5 suggestions would have made my life so much easier when I first started to dip my toes into this beautiful craft. And I really hope if you are a beginner knitter this would help you as well to get more interested in knitting and perhaps to get more enjoyment out of this beautiful craft. If you are an experienced knitter, on the other hand, please leave a comment with any suggestion you may have for me and for all of this beautiful community. So without any further ado, let's get started with tip number 1. Get good quality needles. Having good quality needles will definitely help, especially if you are a beginner knitter. When I first started knitting, I went out to my local yarn supply shop and I just bought what I thought were decent needles, or at least what I would need to start knitting, and I got a set of straight needles and a couple of very inexpensive cable needles. Very soon I found out that I'm not good at knitting with straight needles, and kudos to you if you do wonders with those needles, but they are really not for me, and probably I would recommend a beginner as well to start with cable needles. On the cable needles I had absolutely no knowledge around what cable needles should look like or what characteristics they may need. So I got the cheaper I could find, those grey circular needles that are definitely not great. The cable that connects the two needles gets on the way all the time. It has a strong memory, so if it's bent, the memory will keep your cable bent and this will get on the way all the time. And this can be really confusing, especially if you are a beginner knitter. After a few trials and desperation, I must say, I bought myself a set of Knit Pro interchangeable needles. And that opened an entire world to me. The needles are great, the cables have no memory, and they work extraordinarily well for a beginner and as well for a more advanced knitter. Growing into my knitting world and experience, I bought more expensive needles as well, and the job improved all of the time. I am not saying you must spend hundreds of euros on needles or buy the more expensive needle you can find. But starting with a very good quality needle on the likes of Knit Pro or Knitter's Pride, that will definitely help your work. The second tip I would like to share, and that I wish I knew before starting, is to choosing the right yarn for the right project. When I started, again, I had no idea what I was doing. I went out to my yarn supply shop, I found some alpaca yarn that was extremely soft and fluffy and was completely far from what I knew wool was like, so I fell in love and I bought a sweater quantity. My first project was of course a colorwork sweater, but I soon found that alpaca is probably not the best yarn for colorwork, as the stitch definition is not great and the yarn has no elasticity at all. So knitting a first sweater with alpaca yarn, pretending that the color work would result well, wasn't a great choice for me. Some suggestion on choosing the right yarn would be, of course, look at the pattern. Always the pattern suggests a yarn type or a fiber type. And then with that you can go to your yarn shop and ask for a recommendation on how to substitute the yarn, or you can definitely Google yarns with a similar fiber quantity. This is especially important if you use animal or natural fibers. Going through yarn shop can be quite dangerous, as they always have hundreds of different type of yarns, and you may just fall in love with some yarn. So really ask for a recommendation, look at your pattern, and just do a good research on the internet. The next recommendation that I would give you, that I really wish I knew before starting, is to understand gauge. Gauge is always present on every pattern, and it's basically the blocks that are going to build your knitted project going forward. If you take as an example, a building is made out of blocks. Each block has a specific size, and building rows of the same size blocks will give you a building of a certain size. If you change the size of your blocks, you will get different sizes of buildings. And this is basically gauge. Your designer will give you a number of stitches per a defined length, usually is 10 centimeters or 4 inches. When you get on your knitting that exact number of stitches per that exact length, you will definitely get the same block that your designer used to build their house or their buildings, ergo their project. And this is very important when you knit a garment. If you want a specific size, respecting the gauge that your designer gave you, that is paramount. Let's talk about a number. Let's take, for example, a garment that is knitted following a gauge of 22 stitches per 10 centimeters or 4 inches. When you swatch, and we'll talk about swatching in a second, the gauge may change taking into account your tension, your needle size, or the type of yarn that you're using. You really want to get to that gauge of 22 stitches per 10 centimeters or 4 inches. And to achieve that gauge, you may just want to modify the number of your needles, going up or down in size. That is always the easiest part. You don't really want to modify your tension. Your tension is natural, so it can't really be modified that much. Gauge can a little bit be overcome going up or down in size, but I personally made so many mistakes that I would recommend to swatch all the time, so to try and get the right gauge for your piece. And we get into swatching as my next tip. Something that I really hate is swatching, so basically creating a little 10 centimeter 4 inches square just to understand your gauge. I hate it because, in my opinion, it's a waste of time and a waste of yarn. I always urge myself to get into the finished work, to get into the pattern and work into my project, rather than starting with a square, useless square of yarn. Anyway, something that I wish I knew was to swatch and make something out of that swatch. It can be a cowl, it can be a pair of socks, it can be a cushion or a square for a blanket. Always draws my attention more, always makes me actually swatch if I know that at the end of the swatch I will have a final work or a proper object that I can wear or use in the house. So every time you swatch, think about creating something. It can be as simple as a hat or a cowl in the round. And then, as final tip, I would recommend you to always block your final work. Blocking is actually an integral part of knitting and producing a final project, in my opinion. I discovered blocking very late in my knitting journey, and as soon as I saw all the benefit of blocking, I couldn't stop, and I block every single pieces of mine. So blocking is basically putting your garment into shape. When you knit, your tension may be a little different, your yarn may have a shape memory that needs to lose when it's knitted up in the final garment, and there are so many other reasons. Your size may not be as perfect as you wish, so all of this can be resolved with blocking. Blocking is basically soaking your garment in water for about 20 minutes to a couple of hours. Get all that water into your fiber and squish it off and let your fiber rest and dry on a flat surface. You can get the garment to dry into the right shape using some pins, and that is really helpful. Another way of blocking that I learned during the way is the so-called steam blocking. So basically steaming your garment with a hot steam iron and then lay it flat to dry up. This is a much quicker way and works especially well for rustic yarn and color work. It doesn't really work for ribbing or cable knitting, as it may lose a little bit the shape. So here are my 5 tips, something that I really wish I knew before starting. I hope this was helpful, and if it was, please let me know what you think. If you have any other tips, that would be extremely helpful. I am not an experienced knitter by any means, but I do have a couple of years on my back as a knitter. If you find this of any use, please consider to subscribe to my channel. This will massively help me to build my little community. And if you want to get notified with my next video, please click on the bell button down on the right hand corner of this video, I suppose. And yeah, if you are an experienced knitter and you have some tips that I should follow, let me know in the comments. I would really appreciate that. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye bye.